Hi everyone, welcome. I'm preparing to check in on this bin over here. It's got some African nightcrawlers in it. The system's 235 days old today, and it's due for a feeding, so I'm going to slip on a glove, get it up on the bench, and we're going to get to work. You know, for the longest time in this bin here, we were always looking at a bunch of material that was isolated within this red bag here. And it was material that was sort of had this weird rubbery, springy texture to it. It seemed like after many hundreds of days, the stuff just would not break down, so we finally got around to excluding it from this system last time. So that whole storyline is over now, but this is just a quick reminder that this is that system in which we were dealing with that quarantined material, and it's kind of nice that it's finally out of the picture. So let's see, let's remove this top covering of plastic, see how things are progressing in here. There's a little bit of bright sunlight streaming in through the window into here. Hopefully not going to disturb the camera's exposure of the scene. Perhaps if we, yeah, wondering if I can kind of stand here and block the light a little bit. And what you see over here is meant to indicate to us where we last fed. It's a coffee filter, and usually I'll use some sort of a coffee filter or something to mark where we last fed. But after a while, when the coffee filter or the feeding zone indicator begins to wear down to this point, I start to think that it might be a good idea to swap it out with a new one. And it just so happens that today's supply of bedding that we were going to use consists of a whole bunch of stuff, which is including, I don't know, I got about 5 or 6, maybe even 7 coffee filters in here. Some of them even have the coffee in them still. And mixed in here are also some paper towels. So that's what I had intended to use today as our bedding. And we'll just set one of those coffee filters aside so that at the end we can cover up with it in the middle to show ourselves where we last fed. Because I just figured I would follow suit with what we've been doing for the most part in here for quite a while now, which is just feeding the system right down the middle. So I'm just going to throw this piece of coffee filter that I just removed along with the mix it in there with the rest of the stuff that we're going to use as bedding. And now we can see how things look here with that plastic covering on here going pretty much edge to edge all the way around. It left very little material, perhaps a little bit out here, to get exposed to the air and get dry. And that's probably the reason when we first came in here there were a few worms on the surface out there to greet us, which was always kind of nice. I don't know, when I first saw this it seemed to me like it was a worm, but it's just some sort of a piece of vegetable matter, perhaps the stem of something. Just its color and stuff made it look like it was a worm. Here we have an actual worm. So let's explore, see how things are coming along in here. I figured maybe we would kind of check out the outskirts of the bin first, and then we'll dig down into the spot where we fed most recently. For a 235-day-old system, it's not surprising that for the most part what we're seeing in here is worm castings everywhere. Every now and then when I'm tilling through the material in my worm bins, I do try to see if I can introduce some stuff other than worm castings into these outer edges. Since all the feeding and all the supplementary bedding usually ends up going right down in the middle into the feeding area, sometimes I try to incorporate a little bit of stuff other than just worm castings into these outer edges of the systems. So I'm starting to see some stuff like leaf stems, perhaps some leftover food bits, little bits of leftover bedding materials. And I kind of like it that way. I wonder if this is some of that quarantine material. It's just when I find something that really seems to stand out. I guess the telltale of that was that it was really springy. Like when I would pull it, it would stretch. This simply doesn't even break, and I could tell from the way it's shimmering too. It's a piece of plastic. So I make my best effort to try to exclude any materials like that before placing things into my shredder. So hopefully the only stuff that ends up going through my shredder is stuff that's actually a paper product, which lends itself to break down in the worm bins, but here and there something sneaks through. But I do try to limit the debris inside my worm bins that doesn't belong there. So sometimes it's pretty easy to spot, like that piece really stood out just because it's really bright color. It showed no signs of absorbing any moisture, becoming darker because it was getting damp or anything like that. So luckily it's pretty easy to spot and remove. But since this is the system where we did put in a bunch of extra effort to isolate a bunch of material that didn't seem quite right, and then even gave it a whole bunch of time to see if it would eventually break down, I just really feel like I've got to be vigilant to make sure I'm not left with any weird stuff like that. So now we're actually bumping into some food scraps. Little piece of corn cob there that ended up all the way on the outskirts. Since I do usually feed in the middle, but then I do usually push things to the outer edges to make room in the middle when I want to feed, sometimes food bits like that end up out in the edges. But usually by this time materials get pushed to the outer edges, they're for the most part pretty close to being broken down already. And it's usually just little scraps of bedding type materials that I try to throw out here for the worms to nibble on. And that's the reason it's mainly castings out here, with little bits of leaf stems and other various scraps of bedding type materials mixed in. System's looking really nice. So now this system's already been fed. Let's see, I got some notes over here on the side. Yeah, it got its 18th feeding 13 days ago. This will be feeding number 19. And I don't know. I'm questioning how much further I want to go. I'm usually in no rush to harvest. To me, it seems like if there remains room in the system to continue on, then why not continue on? But since I do like to push things up around the edges when I'm working here, kind of shove stuff off to the side, I do need to leave myself a little bit of empty room to permit that type of worm bin maintenance, my style of worm bin maintenance. I know on other channels some people will kind of go on and on about, not go on and on, but I mean, sometimes you hear about, you know, how you shouldn't really meddle with the environment that the worms live in so much. You should just kind of give them the food or bedding that you're going to give them, kind of just toss it in, throw it in on top, and leave them be. And then there's other schools of thought that suggest that aerating the material within your worm bin is also beneficial. And I guess I'm a little bit more in that side of the thinking. Perhaps because I do believe that I've encountered some weird situations in my bins in the past where perhaps the lack of aeration could have been what led to some really bad conditions. So now that right there is the pit out of a plum, and 3 big, huge plums were fed to this system last time. And I kind of figured that we might not see any leftovers of the fruit itself, but the plums would certainly survive a 13-day interval between feedings. So my guess was that if all the flesh of the fruit had been nibbled clean of the pits, then the pits could simply be removed today. But I'm not going to go too out of my way to try to track down and extract those items. If we bump into them, that's fine. If not, I'm sure it's just a matter of time before we do eventually stumble on them. So now here I'm assuming we're seeing some clumps of bedding type materials. This looks like the types of shredded bedding materials that I usually use when I maintain my bins, and I think we've just stumbled on pit number 2 out of 3. Again, looking like it's been pretty much stripped clean of all the yummy fruit. So we'll set that aside. And it's starting to make me feel like we are probably going to end up encountering the 3rd one too if we continue examining the feeding area this way. I do remember commenting during the last video how this bin really did seem to be quite busy in terms of the number of worms occupying it. So again, I'm looking off to the side because I did take some notes for myself regarding not only the age and the number of feedings and the interval between feedings, but the estimated worm count in this system. When we first launched it was an estimated 2,217 worms. And here we are, pit number 3. It was almost like a little scavenger hunt. I didn't know what to expect, you know, but you figure you put in 3 delicious plums for the worms to nibble on. It's not too surprising that they do away with it, especially if you give them almost 2 weeks to do so. So I think we've already tilled up the feeding area quite nicely, but I think we're going to have to excavate a little bit better. But before I do, I want to remove these pits. I've got a little collection of stuff like this off on the side. I'm still debating on what to do with this stuff. At some point eventually I will want to maybe try something with this stuff, but it's just sitting off on the side. Every time I encounter a pit or something like that, I do put the stuff that I gather that's like that off into a little bucket. I've already got at least a gallon of that sort of stuff collected. So let's open up a nice big hole here into which we could plop today's feeding. Oh my goodness. Yeah, there are a good number of worms living in this bin. Got to admit. Oh, what's this? Piece of corn. So yeah, why don't we give these little wormies a moment to settle down, to dive down into the bedding, and then we'll proceed to drop in their food supply for today. So we're going to come in with our supply of various bedding type materials. Here's one of the coffee filters that seems to have a little bit of coffee adhering to it still. Coffee too is a food source, so besides the collection of veggies, not even veggies, fruits, all they're getting today is fruits. I've also got my collection of coffee off here on the side. So, like I said, we're going to hang on to one of these as our feeding zone indicator to drape over the top of the system to show ourselves where we last fed. And, well, I'm not sure we need all of these. I mean, maybe we could use a couple more of them. But I also want to use these paper towels as well. So let's use this as the foundation to drop in today's feeding. So now what they're getting is fruits, like I mentioned earlier. There's going to be an entire pear. That's going to go right in the middle. I think that should make for a nice, interesting spot to check in on next time. Should there be any leftovers, there should be a good amount of worms working on it at the end. Now here, these are some blueberries. Wow, quite a bit of food going in here today, gotta say. And on top of that, a couple of banana peels. Well, it might just be one banana peel. But it also looks like it's the stem end where the whole bunch connects up into itself. So that's our feeding for today. Oh, in the category of bedding, I also kind of had a little bit of an issue with my shredder, my paper shredder. So I spent a good bit of time picking all kinds of material that got itself jammed in between the wheels, in between the cutting wheels of the shredder. And it's all paper products, I assume, so I picked it out of there and I set it aside, and I figured, you know, this too can also serve as a interesting bedding material for the worms to nibble on. So it's for the most part cardboard, I believe. A little bit dusty, but to me that seemed like stuff that the worms should probably enjoy. So this was my supply of coffee. I threw in some coffee for them. Give them a little bit more, why not? And that to me seems like a pretty generous feeding. So now, you know what? We've still got this to pile on top. There's actually 3 of them here, it would seem. And you know what? This one's kind of clean. Sometimes I like to have one of these just resting nearby as a, just in case something I want to grab, in case I want to wipe my hands clean of something. So that one I'll set aside. And we're really down to just 2 of these coffee filters anymore. So you know what? One will go beneath the surface and the other one at the end will go on top of the surface as our feeding zone indicator. That'll be this one. So let's start backfilling. I think we had a few leftovers here, a couple corn cob bits that we encountered along the way that I kind of threw off to the side. Let's get those down into the feeding zone as well. And now I think we're down to just basic worm castings scattered with little bits of this and that. All right. Yeah, that was a pretty good size feeding, perhaps a little more than I thought it would be. Oh boy, all these worms. I always forget that, you know, when it comes time to cover up after you've given the worms a chance to retreat into the nearby materials, they're probably right there, right beneath the surface, waiting for me to come back over and disturb them again. But I think we're done disturbing them for the day. I think we're just going to go ahead and cover up the way we found the place here. We found it with a nice feeding zone indicator, and the feeding zone indicator will probably get beaten up pretty good. Beaten up and eaten up. So, who knows? Next time we come in here, our feeding zone indicator might be ready to get reused as bedding in the system. And then we'll replace it again. Alright everyone, that's it for our little check-in with the African night crawlers today. On day 235, the system's coming along really nice, I gotta say. I'm really enjoying how this worm system's coming along. Feeding number 19. Next time it'll be feeding 20. Alright everyone, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye.